I've been getting lots of questions about my two favorite spinning tools, the Stencils 360 and the Altenew Stampwheel. I know that many of you don't have these tools, and there's no pressure, but just for fun and education, let's do a comparison. First, let's take a look at the tools themselves. The Stencils 360 tool is from a Canadian company, Penguin Palace Stamps. It came on the market in 2020, and it's designed to be used with circular stencils made by Penguin Palace specifically for the tool. The tool itself is a base that's about 14 by 14 inches, along with some stencil guides that allow you to work with different size stencils. It also comes with some paper placement guides to help you center various sizes of cardstock inside the base. The stamp wheel is from Altenew, and it was introduced earlier this year. It has a base that's about 9 by 9 inches and a 7.5 by 7.5 inch photopolymer sticky mat that goes inside the base, plus the clear wheel, which is about 11 inches along the widest diameter. It can be used for things beyond spinning, but I'm going to focus on the spinning in this comparison. I've added numbers to the pedals on my wheel to help me with the counting that comes when you're spinning and using multiple colors, and I found that to be extremely helpful. The main difference between these tools is that the Stencils 360 will help you turn or spin stencils, and the stamp wheel will help you turn stamps. So let's see some examples. To turn with the Stencils 360, first I use the 6 by 6 inch paper guide to help me center my cardstock panel. When I'm using this tool, I like to use a larger panel than a card front so I can get the full design and then choose which portion to use on my card. I've got the 4-inch stencil from the Sacred Lotus set already taped into the 4-inch stencil guide. I've put purple tape like this to make sure that I don't get any stray ink blending between the stencil and the guide onto my cardstock. I've got the line with the arrow pointing straight up at 12 o'clock, and turning the guide and lining up that line with the shapes on the base of the tool will turn the stencil the perfect amount to create a design. Right now, because I've got 4 colors and I'm feeling lazy about cleaning the stencil and changing colors each time, I'm counting out the squares to the next one where I want to put the Limoncello ink down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Then I do it again, and I'm done with the Limoncello. I'm using the squares this time, and that will give me 24 petals in my flower. Remember that number, 24. We'll talk about that in a minute. So I've created a 6-pointed flower here, and I could just leave it like this, but I want to fill in my design completely. So I cleaned the stencil and lined up the arrow at the next square from 12 o'clock, and then I filled it in with Tiki torch ink. Same routine. I filled it in, then I turned and counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. You can see that I'm coming in heavy on each end of the petals and lightening up towards the center. That will give the petals some dimension. Again, and now I'm done with Tiki torch. Now it's time for Tutti Frutti. I started with the petals lined up at the 3rd square and I fill them in. 1, 2, 3, 4, blend. 1, 2, 3, 4, blend. My final color was party dress, and I think you're getting it, so I'll save you all the counting and just show you the final result. Now let's try for a similar look with the stamp wheel. I don't have a stamp the exact same shape as the petals in the Lotus stencil, but I do have this one from the Altenew Mod Fruit Bowl set. To position the stamp, I put the wheel into the base upside down, and I put the stamp down on the line that points down to my number 1. That etch line helps me make sure that it's perfectly straight, although there's nothing saying you couldn't stamp it crooked if you wanted a different look. Again, I've got 4 colors, and this time I've got 16 turns, so I'll have 4 of each color. I inked up the stamp with some lime Rickey ink, and I stamped it down so that the 1 was at the bottom of the wheel. I know that next I need to stamp it down at the 5, then at the 9, and then at the 13. And of course you can see right through the wheel, so you can know that you've got things in the right place. It's going to form a 4-petal flower at this point. Next I'm moving to Fiesta Blue, and I need to start at 2, then 6, then 10, and then 14. I find it easiest to actually say the numbers to myself as I'm turning. And of course you could clean the stamp each time and change colors and work through 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 16. But again, my laziness about cleaning is forcing me to be a little more mathematical in my positioning. My next color is Serenade, and the numbers are 3, 7, 11, and 15. Finally, I've got Flirty Fuchsia on 4, 8, 12, and 16, and my flower is done. Here they are, and you can see that it's possible to get a similar look with the most basic use of both these tools. But remember, I chose to do 24 petals on the 360 flower. I can't do that with the stamp wheel. It has to be 4, 8, or 16 turns to get a full circle design because of the design of the tool. To finish all my cards today, I did pretty much the same thing. I added a black panel behind, a waffle flower die-cut birthday sentiment, and for these smaller designs, I stamped the happy from another waffle flower set, and I added some dewdrops from Crafty Meraki. So we can't do 24 turns with the stamp wheel, but what we can do is make a bigger design with the same stamp. All you have to do is move the stamp further down the line away from the center, and you can move it anywhere along that line. You could even stamp multiple rings, changing the distance from the center to get a multi-layered looking design. So there's lots of flexibility here. So can you do that with the 360 tool? Well, I figured out a way. I'm still using the 4-inch Lotus stencil, but instead of using the 4-inch guide, I'm using the 6-inch guide. Here's where the stencil would sit if it's centered. So by moving it up toward the edge of the stencil guide, I'm basically moving the shape out away from the center. I'm pushing it under the stencil guide and taping it in place. This will mean that the stencil is right up against the cardstock, but to make sure that it still turns smoothly, I'm also taping the stencil to the back of the guide. This time I've only got 1 petal showing on my stencil, so my counting will have to be right on point to get this all done correctly. And there's not much space on the edge of the stencil, so I need to be careful not to overblend. I could mask it, but I would have to lift the mask each time I turn the stencil. And I don't know if you've heard, but I'm pretty lazy about these things, so I'm just going to risk it. Back to my hot colors, and I start with Limoncello. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Until I've got my 6-pointed flower. I grabbed Tutti Frutti next, just to change it up a little bit, and I put down my 6 petals. So far, so good. Next up was Tiki Torch, and I got distracted right here. I lost count. No worries, I'm not going to start over. I'll just reverse these 2 colors here, and once it's all filled in, I don't think anyone will notice. Time for party dress, and by now, I'm just turning the wheel to the blank spot and then making sure it's lined up with the square on the base and blending it in. This would make a pretty sunflower design, all in yellow with a big brown center. For the bigger stamp wheel design, I used the die-cut Happy and Birthday since that center white area was so much larger than the 360 design. That's pretty basic, using the same tools to make smaller and bigger designs. What's next? How about this? You can create your own stencils to use with the 360, and then you can stamp on top with the stamp wheel. Let me show you. I cut a heart from a piece of cardstock, and I'm going to line it up and tape it down to this 6-inch stencil guide, similar to how I did it with the Lotus stencil in the previous card. I lined it up with the 12 o'clock position, and I taped it down to the back to help it turn smoothly over my cardstock panel. This time, since I'm using both tools, I'm using the full rainbow of ink. And the important thing is, I'm using the heart shape on the base for my positioning. That's the shape that will give me 16 turns in total, which is important because I want to do some stamp wheel stamping when I'm finished. I blended my ink through my 4 hot colors, and then I felt like I should create another cardstock stencil for the cool ones. You could use an actual stencil that has an isolated shape like this, or you could cut it out of acetate or stencil material if you want it to be more permanent. Whoops, right there, the stencil caught on the corner of my cardstock. No worries, you can just lift the whole thing up, and because of the lines on the guide and on the base, you can easily put your stencil back in place where you need to blend the next color. Okay, now to be successful at the stamping, I need to have this panel centered exactly on the stamp wheel base. I bought the centering tools that Altenew sells for this purpose. They're little L-shaped pieces of stencil material that sit in the corner and make this much easier. But to double check and be absolutely sure, I put the wheel in place and took a look at that X in the center and also the lines along the 2 limoncello hearts and the 2 fuchsia hearts. Then I grabbed some tiny heart stamps from an old Pretty Pink Posh sentiment set. There's some outline and solid hearts, and I lined them up kind of randomly within one of the limoncello hearts. I stamped them up with black ink in the number 1 position, and then I had a thought. Rather than stamping all 16 exactly the same, I would skip one and do all the odd numbers like this. Then I moved the stamps to the lime Rickey heart, and I still put the wheel in place with 1 on the bottom, and I stamped the odd numbers again to fill in the spaces between. I think doing 2 different arrangements gave it a bit more of a random look. I trimmed down the panel, added my die cut sentiment, and a whole bunch of dewdrops in all 6 of the colors available, and I think this turned out to be really fun. And a number of you have mentioned that this tool gives similar results to the Wreath Builder templates, and you're absolutely right. With the Wreath Builder, which is a much more affordable tool, you use your MISTI and you turn your paper rather than the stamp to build the wreath. You are limited to the size of the Wreath Builder, which is not a bad thing at all. They're designed to fit the whole wreath perfectly onto an A2 card. And as we've seen, you can make wreaths that fit onto an A2 card, or you can make them bigger, limited by the size of this base, which is 7.5 inches. I love the look of geometric circular designs, so these 2 spinning tools truly are favorites in my craft room. And although they work very differently, and although they can work together, you don't necessarily need them both, or either one. As I said, I just thought it would be fun to play around. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see more about how I use these tools, you can start here with my introductory videos for each one. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.